The air inside the rehearsal hall was always cool, almost too cold, but it was the kind of cold that helped you think. It was a large, square room with high ceilings and soft carpet on the floor that swallowed up the sound of footsteps. The walls were painted a plain, light color, and there were no windows to look out of, so the only thing that mattered was what was happening in the center of the room. Today, the hall felt heavier than usual. It felt like the air was being pressed down by something you couldn't see. Standing on the podium in the middle of the room was Maestro Victor Kessler. He was a man who didn't need to shout to be scary. He was tall and very thin, and he stood perfectly straight, like a ruler had been glued to his spine. He wore a dark jacket that looked like it had been pressed 100 times, and his white hair was combed back so tightly that not a single strand moved out of place. He held a thin wooden stick in his right hand, tapping it against a metal music stand. Tap. 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 The sound was sharp, like a clock ticking down to something bad. Kessler was not a man who smiled unless he was proving someone wrong. He looked out at the 90 musicians sitting in front of him, his eyes moving quickly from one face to another. He was looking for mistakes. He was looking for someone who wasn't holding their instrument right. He was looking for a reason to be unhappy. Behind the rows of violins, cellos, and tall basses, almost hidden in the corner where the shadows were a little darker, sat Illyra. She was young, much younger than most of the people in this room. She was wearing a black suit that looked a little too big for her, like she had borrowed it from an older sibling. The jacket sleeves were just a fraction too long, hiding her wrists. She sat on a bench in front of a massive, black grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, shiny and reflective, but next to the entire orchestra, it looked small and lonely. Illyra's hands were resting on her lap. She was clenching her fingers together so hard that her knuckles were turning white. She felt her heart beating fast, thumping against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. This was her big chance. She had spent years practicing in small rooms with bad acoustics, playing on old pianos that missed notes, just to get here. But looking at Maestro Kessler's back, she felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. Kessler did not want a piano soloist in his spring concert. He had made that very clear in every meeting and every email. He believed that the orchestra was perfect on its own. He thought that adding a piano was like adding an extra splash of color to a painting that was already finished. He felt it was unnecessary. He especially didn't want a young, unknown player. He thought young players were all flash and no heart. "All right, let us begin," Kessler said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room. "We start at the opening, and please, try to keep the brass section under control. We are not trying to wake the dead." A few musicians shifted in their seats. There was a quiet murmur of pages turning. The mood in the room was tense. Everyone knew that Kessler was in a bad mood, and everyone knew that he was looking for a reason to stop the rehearsal early. He raised his baton. The room went silent. He brought his hand down. The sound that exploded from the orchestra was huge. It wasn't just music, it was a wall of noise. The trumpets blared, the drums crashed, and the violins sawed back and forth with aggressive energy. Kessler wanted it loud. He wanted it intimidating. He was looking at the musicians, but his mind was on the girl in the corner. He wanted to see if she would panic. He wanted to see if she would shrink away into the shadows. He looked over his left shoulder, just for a second, and his eyes found Illyra. She was sitting still, staring at the keys. She wasn't playing yet. Her part was coming in a few measures. Kessler felt a small smile tug at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the kind of smile a cat gives to a mouse. He turned back to the orchestra and waved his baton, signaling them to play even louder. The trombones joined in, filling the room with a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated in the floorboards. It was overwhelming. It was meant to show her that she didn't belong here, that the orchestra was a powerful machine that would crush her if she wasn't strong enough. Illyra sat there, listening. The noise was physical. It hit her in the chest. She saw the violins swaying back and forth, their bows moving in a blur. She saw the flute player puffing out her cheeks. She saw the sweat already forming on the conductor's forehead. For a second, fear tried to grab her. It whispered in her ear that she was too small, that she was too young, that she was a nobody. She thought about the small apartment she grew up in. She thought about the old, upright piano that sat in the living room, the one with the faded felt on the hammers. She thought about her mother sitting in the armchair next to it, listening to her practice for hours every night. Her mother was the reason she was here. Her mother loved this music, but she couldn't come to rehearsals. She couldn't travel anymore. Illyra closed her eyes for just a moment and pictured her mother's hands clapping slowly, the way she did after every song, no matter how many mistakes were made. That memory gave her a warm feeling in the middle of the cold rehearsal hall. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the air-conditioned air. She let the fear drain out of her shoulders. Maestro Kessler was enjoying himself. He was pushing the tempo, making the music faster and more chaotic. He was stealing glances back at the girl, waiting to see her hand go up. He was waiting for her to signal that she couldn't hear herself, that it was too loud, that she wanted to stop. If she did that, he would cut her. He would tell her she wasn't ready, and he would be right. But Illyra didn't raise her hand. She didn't look scared. She looked at the keys, and she waited. She was listening to the rhythm, finding the pulse inside the noise. The music around her was angry, but she held onto something calm and steady inside herself. The piece was building to a climax. The orchestra was playing at full volume. The sound bounced off the walls and the ceiling, creating a chaotic echo. It was the moment right before the piano was supposed to enter. It was the moment of silence before the storm. Kessler slowed down just a fraction, making a gap in the wall of sound. He looked back at her, his smirk still there, his eyes cold and challenging. It was a test. He was daring her to jump into the rushing river of sound and drown. Illyra didn't hesitate. She didn't look at the conductor. She didn't look at the musicians. She looked at her hands. She saw them not as small and weak, but as instruments of everything she had ever learned, every sacrifice she had ever made. She lifted her hands from her lap. She positioned them over the keys, her fingers curved and ready. The smirk on the conductor's face grew wider, thinking he had won, thinking she was trembling with fear. He was wrong. She wasn't trembling. She was gathering power. The silence stretched out for one heartbeat longer. Then, her fingers came down. The moment her fingers touched the keys, the air in the room seemed to shift. It wasn't a loud crash, and it wasn't a fast, confusing run of notes. Ilora played a single, high note. It was a natural, clear, and sharp, like a beam of white light cutting through a dark, dusty room. The sound rang out, hanging in the air above the noise of the orchestra, refusing to be swallowed up. Maestro Kessler flinched. He was expecting the piano to fight back with loudness, or to disappear into the background with weakness. He was not expecting this. This note was different. It had a vibration to it that seemed to make the metal music stands shiver. It pierced through the heavy brass and the low rumble of the drums. Ilora didn't stop to see if anyone had heard. She let that first note fade just enough, and then her right hand moved. She began to play the melody. It wasn't the way she had practiced it in her music theory class. It wasn't the way the sheet music strictly said it should be played. She was playing it the way she felt it. Her fingers were light, dancing over the ivory keys with a gentle touch that made the piano sound like it was singing. The melody was simple, sad, and sweet. It flowed like water moving over smooth stones in a river. She remembered the song her mother used to hum to her when she was a little girl and couldn't sleep. It was a tune without words, just a sound that meant safety and home. She poured that feeling into the keys. She wasn't thinking about the complicated notes or the timing. She was thinking about love. Thomas, the older man sitting at the front of the cello section, was the first to notice. He had been playing the cello for 40 years. He had played in hundreds of orchestras and worked with dozens of conductors. He had seen many young musicians come and go. Most of them were nervous. Most of them played with their heads down, just trying to get through the song without making a mistake. Thomas was in the middle of a long, drawn-out note when he heard Ilora's melody. He felt a strange sensation in his chest. The sound coming from the piano wasn't just entering his ears, it was tugging at something inside him. It reminded him of his own daughter, who lived miles away and whom he hadn't seen in 2 years. He stopped thinking about the sheet music in front of him. He stopped thinking about Kessler's angry face. Without even realizing he was doing it, his bow slowed down. He made his cello softer, quieter. He wanted to hear the piano better. Next to Thomas, a young woman playing the violin felt the same change. She was stressed, her fingers hurting from the difficult piece Kessler had chosen. She was watching the conductor's baton, waiting for the next signal. But the sound of the piano was so captivating that her eyes wandered away from the podium. She looked toward the back of the room. She saw the young woman in the oversized suit, sitting with a straight back, moving her hands with incredible grace. The violinist lowered her instrument slightly. The aggressive sound she was making faded into a soft hum. It was like a chain reaction, but a quiet one. It started with the string section, closest to the piano. The musicians stopped looking at Kessler. They stopped trying to overpower the room with volume. They started to listen. They realized that the music wasn't a battle anymore. It was a conversation. And for the first time, the piano was actually speaking. Maestro Kessler, however, did not like this. He was a man of order. He wanted the sound to be exactly the way he had planned it. He saw the musicians relaxing. He saw them looking away from him. He felt his control slipping away. The smirk on his face vanished, replaced by a sharp look of annoyance. He shook his baton violently at the brass section. He wanted the trumpets and trombones to play louder, to drown out this soft, distracting piano noise. He wanted to remind Elora that she was just a guest, and that the orchestra was the boss. The trumpet player saw the signal. He lifted his instrument to his lips, took a deep breath, and blasted out a loud, harsh note. But something strange happened. The trumpet note sounded wrong. It didn't sound powerful, it sounded rude. It sounded like someone shouting in a library while everyone else was whispering. The trumpet player heard the contrast between his loud blast and Elora's gentle, weaving melody, and he felt embarrassed. He pulled the trumpet away from his lips halfway through the note, cutting it short. The percussionist, a man with long gray hair who was sitting behind a large set of drums, was about to crash his cymbals together. It was written in the music. He raised his hands high. But just as he was about to bring them together, Elora's piano did a little turn in the melody. It was a hopeful little trill, like a bird taking flight. The percussionist hesitated. He looked at the cymbals in his hands, then at the girl at the piano. He slowly lowered his hands to his lap. The cymbals remained silent. Elora was in a world of her own now. She couldn't see Kessler's red face or his frantic baton movements. She didn't see the trumpet player putting his instrument down. Her eyes were closed. She was playing from memory. Her hands moved further apart, covering more of the keyboard. The left hand played deep, low chords that gave the music a heartbeat, a steady, comforting pulse. The right hand played high, spinning notes that floated above the orchestra. She thought about the nights when she was too tired to practice. She thought about how she wanted to give up so many times because it was too hard. But then she would sit at the piano, and the sound would make her feel better. She was playing that feeling now. She was playing the struggle and the relief that comes after. Every note she struck was honest. There was no showing off. There was no ego. It was just pure emotion. The room was transforming. The sterile, cold feeling was gone, replaced by a warmth that seemed to radiate from the black grand piano in the corner. The acoustic panels on the walls, which usually made the room feel dead and dry, seemed to soak up the music and bounce it back softly. The violins, who usually played as a tight group, started to blend their sound with the piano. They weren't playing the melody anymore, they were playing soft, long notes that supported Elora, like a bed of moss under a flower. The bass players slowed their rhythm, matching the deep, slow heartbeat coming from Elora's left hand. Kessler was furious. He was waving his arms, jumping slightly on the podium. He wanted to stop them. He wanted to yell at them to follow his baton. But the musicians were in a trance. They were following the music, not the man. The music had taken on a life of its own. It was pulling everyone along, including the conductor, whether he liked it or not. He looked at Thomas, the lead cellist. Thomas was looking at Elora with a soft smile, his eyes closed, Completely ignoring the sheet music on his stand, Kessler looked at the trumpet player, who was just sitting there, holding his instrument, waiting for the right moment to enter, if it ever came. The noise of the orchestra, which had been a chaotic wall of sound just a few minutes ago, was now structured, gentle, and respectful. They weren't drowning her out anymore. They were stepping back, giving her the floor. They were realizing that this wasn't just a kid playing a solo, this was a young woman telling a story that they all understood. Illyra's music grew a little stronger. It wasn't aggressive, but it was firm. She was playing a complex run of notes now, cascading down the keyboard like raindrops falling on a roof. It was technically difficult, but she made it sound easy. Her fingers knew exactly where to go. The sound was rich and full, filling every corner of the rehearsal hall. Kessler stopped waving his baton for a moment. He just stood there, his arm in the air, panting slightly from exertion. He looked at the girl again. He really looked at her. He saw the way she moved, the way she leaned into the instrument. He heard the beauty of what she was creating. For a split second, his anger paused. A small thought tried to wiggle into his brain, what if she is actually good? But he pushed the thought away quickly. He was the maestro. He decided what was good. He clenched his jaw tighter. He signaled the woodwinds, the flutes and clarinets to jump in. He wanted them to play fast, to mess up her rhythm. He wanted to break her concentration. The flute player raised her instrument. She looked at Illyra, then at Kessler. She heard the sad, beautiful melody Illyra was playing. She knew that if she blew her fast, chirping notes right now, it would ruin the moment. She took a breath, but instead of playing the fast notes written on the paper, she played a single, soft harmony that matched Illyra's chord. Kessler's eyes went wide. He couldn't believe it. They were disobeying him. They were rewriting the music in real time to suit this girl. He looked around the room. The orchestra was no longer a machine following his commands. It was a living thing, breathing with the piano. And he was the only one left outside. The music coming from the piano was no longer just sound, it was a living thing. Illyra had moved past the gentle introduction and was now playing a section that required more power. But it wasn't the harsh, loud banging that Maestro Kessler was used to hearing from young students. It was a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the bottom of the piano's frame. She leaned forward slightly, her body swaying with the rhythm, fully connected to the instrument. The orchestra, confused and captivated, was struggling to find its place. The sheet music on their stands told them to play loud and fast, to crash and boom. But their ears told them something different. Their hearts told them to be quiet. It was a strange feeling for professional musicians. They spent their entire lives following the notes on the page, following the strict commands of the conductor. But today, the music felt like it was being written in the air, changing and growing right in front of them. Thomas, the cellist, stopped playing entirely. He just rested his hand on the neck of his instrument. He was listening to the way Illyra phrased a run of notes going up the scale. It was flawless, but more importantly, it felt real. He looked at the other musicians. He saw the trumpet player looking down at his shoes. He saw the violinists with their bows hovering just above the strings, motionless. They were all waiting. They were all listening. Maestro Kessler's face was turning a shade darker. He looked like a man watching a car crash in slow motion, except he was the one driving the car. He could feel the power draining away from his podium. Usually, when he tapped his baton, 90 people jumped. Now, when he waved his arms, they just looked at him with apologetic eyes. They were trapped between his anger and the beauty coming from the corner. He decided he had to stop this. He couldn't let the rehearsal continue like this. It was a rebellion. He opened his mouth to yell, to scream stop, so loudly that the sound would break the spell. He took a sharp breath in. But just as the air was about to leave his lungs, Illyria hit a chord that was so rich, so full of emotion, that it physically stopped him. It was a minor chord, sad and heavy, but it had a shimmering note on top of it that sounded like hope. The sound seemed to hang in the air for a long time. Kessler found himself holding his breath. For a moment, he forgot he was angry. He forgot he was the boss. He just heard the sound, and it made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. It made him feel small. Illyria's eyes were still closed. In her mind, the rehearsal hall had vanished. She wasn't in the cold room with the beige walls anymore. She was back in her childhood home. She was imagining the smell of dinner cooking in the kitchen. She was imagining the sound of rain tapping against the window pane, the sound that used to make her feel safe inside. She was playing that feeling of warmth and protection for the people in this room. She didn't know it, but that was exactly what they needed. The silence from the orchestra began to spread. It wasn't a quiet, nervous silence. It was a respectful silence. The musicians realized that they couldn't add anything to this. If they played their parts, they would just be noise. They would be covering up a masterpiece with paint. One by one, they lowered their instruments. The violins dropped into their laps. The flutes went down to the floor. The clarinet players took their mouthpieces out of their mouths. Thomas let his cello bow rest on his knee. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He looked at the conductor. He saw Kessler standing there, his mouth half open, ready to shout, but no sound coming out. Thomas shook his head very slightly, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. It was a signal. Let it be, Maestro. Just let it be. Kessler saw the shake of the head. He saw the defiance in the eyes of his lead cellist. He looked around and saw that the entire orchestra had stopped. They weren't looking at him. Every single pair of eyes was fixed on the young woman in the black suit. The power in the room had completely shifted. It was no longer at the front of the room on the podium. It was at the back, in front of the keyboard. The only sound in the massive hall was the piano. Illyria was playing a complex passage now, her fingers moving rapidly across the keys. Her left hand was playing a steady, heartbeat rhythm in the bass, while her right hand played a melody that spun and danced like a ribbon in the wind. It was technically perfect, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the story. She was playing a story of struggle. She was playing about the times she wanted to quit. She was playing about the nights she cried because she didn't think she was good enough. The emotion in the music was so strong that you could almost touch it. It filled the room like a thick fog. It wrapped around the musicians and the conductor. It squeezed at their hearts. Even the people who were just there to set up chairs or clean the room stopped what they were doing. They stood in the back of the hall, holding brooms and music stands, listening. Ilora didn't know that everyone had stopped playing. She was so deep in the music that she had lost track of the orchestra. She thought they were playing very softly, accompanying her in a gentle way. She felt the music swell inside her, and she put more force into her playing. The piano began to sing louder, the sound ringing off the glass windows of the observation booths at the back of the room. The acoustics of the hall, usually dead and flat, seemed to come alive. The sound bounced off the ceiling and the floor, creating a surround sound experience. It felt like the music was everywhere at once. It was coming from the walls, the floor, and the air. Kessler stood frozen on the podium. His hand was still raised in the air, holding his baton. He felt ridiculous. He felt like a statue that had been left behind while the world moved on. He watched Ilora's hands. He saw the way she moved her fingers, the way she pressed the pedals with her feet. She was playing with a technique that he had only seen in the very best players in the world. But she had something they didn't have. She had a rawness to her playing. It wasn't polished and shiny. It was real. He thought about his own life. He thought about how he had spent years chasing perfection, making sure every note was in the right place at the right time. He realized, listening to this girl, that he had lost the joy of it. He had turned music into math. And here she was, turning math back into magic. The musicians were entranced. They were breathing together, their shoulders rising and falling in time with Ilora's phrases. They were experiencing something that rarely happens in a rehearsal hall. They were experiencing a moment of pure connection. It didn't matter that she was young. It didn't matter that she was wearing a borrowed suit. She was speaking a language that they all understood, and she was speaking it fluently. Ilora's music began to slow down. She was reaching the end of the movement. She played a series of descending chords, each one softer than the last, like footsteps walking away into the distance. The room was incredibly quiet. You could hear the air conditioning humming softly. You could hear the creak of a chair. But mostly, you could hear the fading sound of the piano. Kessler slowly lowered his baton. He looked at his hand, as if he didn't recognize it. He looked at the faces of the musicians. They weren't looking at him for approval anymore. They were looking at him with a look that said, "Did you hear that they were sharing a secret that he wasn't part of?" He felt a pang of jealousy, but it was mixed with a strange sense of relief. He didn't have to control this. He didn't have to do anything. He could just listen. The last chord hung in the air for a long time. It was a single, low note that Ilora held down, letting the vibration die out naturally. She sat very still, her hands still hovering over the keys. She was waiting for the orchestra to come back in. She was waiting for the drums to crash, signaling the end of the piece. She thought they were just waiting for her cue to stop. But there was no crash. There was no cymbal splash. There was no brass fanfare. The silence just stretched on and on. The note faded away until it was completely gone. And still, nobody moved. The orchestra sat in silence. The conductor stood in silence. The only movement was the dust motes dancing in the light beams coming from the ceiling fixtures. Illyra slowly opened her eyes. She blinked a few times, the room coming back into focus. She realized that the music had stopped completely. She looked around, confused. She saw Thomas looking at her with tears in his eyes. She saw the flute player wiping her cheek with a tissue. She saw the trumpet player looking at the floor with a gentle smile. Then, she looked up at the podium. She saw Maestro Kessler. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't scowling. He was just standing there, his baton hanging down by his side, his face unreadable. The air in the room felt different. The coldness was gone. The tension was gone. It was replaced by a heavy, thick feeling of emotion. Illyra realized what had happened. She realized that she had stopped the orchestra not by force, but by touching their hearts. She took a deep, shaky breath and waited to see what would happen next. The last ripple of sound from the piano finally melted into the air, disappearing like mist on a warm morning. But the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt heavy. It felt like the room was holding its breath, waiting to see if the magic was still there or if it had vanished with the music. Illyra sat very still on the bench, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. She kept her head bowed for a moment, letting the memory of the sound wash over her. In her mind, she was still playing, still telling the story to her mother. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her eyes were bright, glistening slightly in the harsh overhead lights. She blinked, looking around the room as if she were waking up from a dream. She expected to see Maestro Kessler shouting. She expected to see the musicians looking at their watches, annoyed that she had taken so much time. She thought she might be in trouble for playing solo when she was supposed to be playing with the group. But what she saw made her heart stop. The orchestra was frozen. 90 highly trained professionals, people who played complicated music for a living, were sitting completely still. They weren't looking at their sheet music. They weren't looking at the clock on the wall. Every single pair of eyes was fixed on her. Thomas, the older cellist, had taken off his glasses and was wiping them with a handkerchief. The trumpet player, a man usually known for his tough demeanor, had his instrument resting on his knee and his arms folded across his chest, just looking at the floor with a soft expression. It wasn't just a few people. It was everyone. From the back row of the percussion section to the front desks of the violins, they had all stopped. They hadn't stopped because Kessler told them to. They hadn't stopped because the music was over. They had stopped because the music Illyra made was so complete, so full of emotion, that adding anything else to it would have ruined it. They had stopped out of respect. Illyra felt a wave of heat rush up her neck and into her cheeks. She shifted uncomfortably on the piano bench. The oversized suit jacket suddenly felt very heavy. She looked up toward the podium, terrified of what she would find there. Maestro Kessler was standing exactly as he was when she closed her eyes. His arm was still raised in the air, holding the thin wooden baton. But his hand wasn't moving. It wasn't twitching with impatience like it usually did. It was frozen, suspended in time. Slowly, almost painfully, Kessler lowered his arm. He let the baton drop until the tip touched the metal stand in front of him. A soft clink echoed through the silent room, but nobody jumped. The sound seemed very small compared to the ocean of music that had just filled the space. Kessler looked at his musicians. He saw the way they were looking at the girl in the corner. He saw the tears in the eyes of the flute player. He saw the look of awe on Thomas's face. He realized with a sudden, jarring clarity that he was the only one in the room who was outside of the moment. He was the only one who hadn't been moved. But that wasn't true. Deep down, under the layers of pride and strict discipline, he felt a strange trembling in his chest. He felt the sting of tears, which he hadn't allowed himself to shed in 20 years. He felt foolish. Here he was, a man who dedicated his life to controlling sound, trying to drown out this girl because he thought he knew better. He thought music was about precision, about following the dots on the page. He thought it was about power, but listening to the silence that hung in the air now, he realized he was wrong. Music wasn't about power. It was about truth. And this girl had just spoken more truth in 5 minutes than he had in his entire career. The dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that it felt like the floor had tilted. Usually, the power flowed from the podium to the musicians. Kessler would give an order, and they would obey, creating sound that flowed outward to the audience. Today, the power had come from the back. The young, unknown player had reached out and grabbed the hearts of the musicians, pulling them into her world. And Kessler had been left standing on his island, alone with his baton. He looked at Elora. She was staring at him now, her eyes wide and fearful, waiting for the judgment. She looked so small behind the massive black piano. She looked like a child who had just broken a vase and was waiting to be scolded. Kessler opened his mouth. The old habit was there. He wanted to criticize. He wanted to say something about her timing, or about how she didn't follow the score. He wanted to regain his authority. He wanted to say, that was unauthorized. Stick to the music. But the words wouldn't come. They stuck in his throat like dry bread. How could he criticize something that made his own orchestra weep? How could he yell at the only person in the room who was actually making music, not just noise? If he scolded her now, he wouldn't look like a boss. He would look like a fool. He would look like a man who couldn't recognize beauty when it was right in front of him. The silence stretched on. It became uncomfortable, but a good kind of uncomfortable. It was the silence of a room that has just heard a secret and is trying to figure out what to do with it. The air conditioning hummed quietly. A chair squeaked as someone shifted their weight. But still, nobody played a note. Thomas, the cellist, cleared his throat softly. He turned his head slightly to look at the conductor. His look wasn't defiant anymore. It was pleading. It was a look that said, "Don't ruin this, maestro. Please, for once in your life, don't ruin this." Elora swallowed hard. She gripped the edge of the piano bench, her knuckles turning white again. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to say, "I'm sorry, I got carried away." But she knew that words were useless now. The music had said everything she had inside her. To speak now would be to break the spell. She just waited, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Kessler looked at the baton in his hand. It felt like a foreign object, a weapon he no longer needed. He loosened his grip on it, letting it dangle loosely between his fingers. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool, still air of the hall. As he breathed out, he felt his shoulders drop. The rigid, angry posture he held so carefully began to collapse. He thought about his own life. He thought about the nights he spent alone in his apartment, listening to old recordings, criticizing every detail. He realized that he hadn't actually enjoyed music in a long time. He had been managing it, controlling it, but not feeling it. Listening to Allura had made him remember why he started conducting in the first place. It wasn't to be the boss. It was to feel the connection. He looked at the musicians again. They were still looking at her. They were smiling, some of them wiping their eyes. They were united by her sound. Kessler realized that he had a choice. He could force them back into line, make them play the boring, stiff version of the piece, and keep his control. Or, he could let go. He could let them follow her. He could step down from his pedestal and let the music be the boss. It was the hardest decision he had ever made in his career. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to take charge, to be the leader, to be the man in charge. But his heart, that small, quiet thing he had ignored for so long, whispered to him to let it go. He looked at Allura one last time. She was terrified. She was shrinking back into the shadows. He knew he needed to do something to tell her it was okay. He needed to show her that she had won, not by defeating him, but by elevating everyone in the room. Slowly, Maestro Victor Kessler, the man with the iron spine and the cold stare, did something no one in the orchestra had ever seen him do. He relaxed his hands. He let his arms fall loosely to his sides. He stopped being the general. He stopped being the judge. He just became a listener. The tension in the room began to ease. The musicians sensed the change. They saw the maestro's posture soften. They realized that the storm had passed. The threat was gone. They looked back at Allura, not with fear for her, but with anticipation. They were waiting to see what she would do next, waiting to see if the magic would return. Kessler stood there, feeling small but feeling strangely light. He wasn't holding onto the music anymore. He was letting the music hold him. And for the first time in years, he didn't want to be the one making the sound. He just wanted to listen. He closed his eyes for a brief second, and when he opened them, the smirk was gone forever, replaced by a look of humble, quiet understanding. The orchestra was silent, the piano was silent, but the music was still there, dancing in the air between them all. The silence that filled the rehearsal hall was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a heart that has been touched deeply and doesn't know how to speak yet. It was heavy and warm, wrapping around everyone like a thick blanket. The air conditioning hummed quietly, a gentle background sound that suddenly seemed very loud in the stillness. No one moved. No one coughed or shifted in their chair. It felt like the entire world had stopped spinning just to listen to the quiet. Allura sat on the bench, her hands hovering just above the keys. Her fingers were trembling slightly, not from fear this time, but from the rush of emotion leaving her body. She felt drained, but in a good way, like after a long cry that finally clears your head. She stared at the black and white ivory keys, her vision slightly blurry. For a long moment, she didn't look up. She was scared that if she looked at the musicians, the feeling would break. She was scared that if she saw the maestro's angry face, she would realize it was all a mistake. But then, she heard a sound. It wasn't a clap or a shout. It was the soft rustle of fabric. Someone was standing up. Slowly, Ilaro lifted her head. She looked toward the podium. Maestro Kessler was still standing there. He hadn't moved from his spot, but he looked different. The sharp, angry lines in his face had smoothed out. His shoulders, which were usually pulled up tight with tension, had dropped. He looked smaller, softer. He wasn't holding his baton like a weapon anymore. His hand hung loosely at his side, the thin wooden stick just barely gripping his fingers. He looked at Illara, and their eyes met. Illara held her breath, waiting for the scolding. She expected him to say, "That was very unprofessional," or "We do not have time for your improvisations." But Kessler didn't say a word. His eyes were red around the edges. He looked at her with a gaze that wasn't judging. It was searching. He was looking at the young woman in the oversized suit, trying to understand where that music came from. He saw her fear, her youth, and her incredible talent. For the first time in decades, he didn't see someone he needed to control. He saw someone he needed to learn from. Then, very slowly, Kessler lowered his head. It was just a small nod, a slight dip of his chin toward his chest. It wasn't a bow of defeat, and it wasn't a bow to a superior. It was a bow of respect. It was the universal sign that says, "You win. You are better than this moment. Thank you." When he raised his head again, he looked out at the orchestra. He didn't need to say anything. The musicians saw the nod. They saw the change in him. And suddenly, the spell broke. It didn't break with chaos. It broke with a wave of sound. Thomas, the cellist, was the first to move. He put his glasses back on his face and looked at Illara with a wide, grandfatherly smile. He tapped his bow against the music stand, a rhythmic tap 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 that echoed through the room. At first, it was just one sound. But then, the trumpet player joined in, tapping his foot against the metal leg of his chair. Thump, thump, thump. The flute player clapped her hands together once, sharply and loudly. The sound grew. It wasn't a polite applause. It was a rhythmic, tribal beat of approval. It was the sound of musicians saying, "We hear you, we feel you." They tapped their bows against their stands, they drummed on their thighs with their hands, they stomped their feet on the carpeted floor. It started as a rumble and grew into a thunderous roar of appreciation. Illara sat there, stunned. She watched as the entire orchestra began to create this rhythm for her. Her mouth opened slightly in surprise. She looked at Thomas, who was now tapping his cello like a drum, grinning at her. She saw the young violinist wiping a tear from her cheek while she tapped her music stand. They weren't just clapping because they had to. They were celebrating because they had been part of something real. Kessler stood on the podium, listening to the rhythm. He didn't try to stop them. He didn't wave his hands to quiet them down. He just stood there, his hands resting on the railing of the podium, and let it happen. A small, genuine smile appeared on his face. It was a strange look for him, like seeing a statue come to life. He looked at the chaos of the orchestra, the noise, and the joy, and he realized this was what music was supposed to be. It wasn't about perfection. It was about connection. The tapping went on for a long time. The acoustic panels of the room soaked up the sound, but the energy bounced around, making Ilora feel like she was floating. She felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She thought about her mother again. She knew her mother couldn't be here, but in this moment, it felt like she was. She felt like her mother was hearing the applause through her heart. Slowly, the rhythmic tapping began to fade. The musicians were tired, but they were happy. They were looking at each other, nodding, talking in low whispers. The barrier between the sections had vanished. The cellos were talking to the trumpets. The percussionists were smiling at the flutes. The room felt united. When the noise finally died down, the silence returned. But it wasn't the heavy, tense silence from before. It was a comfortable silence. A silence of friends resting after a long journey. Kessler cleared his throat. The sound was soft, not raspy or demanding like before. Everyone turned to look at him. They expected instructions. They expected him to say, "Okay, let's try it again, correctly this time." Instead, Kessler looked at his watch. He looked at the musicians, and then he looked at Ilora. "I think," Kessler said, his voice quiet but clear, "that we have done enough for today." The musicians looked at each other in surprise. Kessler never let them go early. He was a strict taskmaster. "But Maestro," one of the violinists started to say, "we still have the second movement to practice." Kessler held up his hand gently to stop her. "The second movement can wait," he said. "We have heard the heart of this piece today. Anything else we do would just be noise. Go home. Rest. Think about what you felt today." He paused, looking down at his score. He closed the book, the sound of the pages snapping together echoing in the quiet hall. "Tomorrow," he continued, looking directly at Ilora, "we will not practice the notes. We will practice the feeling. That is an order." There was a moment of stillness, and then someone in the back row let out a quiet cheer. It wasn't disrespectful, it was pure relief. The musicians began to pack up their instruments. There was a buzz of excitement in the room. They weren't tired and grumpy anymore. They were talking animatedly, pointing toward the piano and at Ilora. Ilora stood up slowly. Her legs felt a little shaky. She reached down and closed the keyboard cover over the keys, wiping away a smudge with her thumb. She picked up her bag, her movements slow and careful. She started to walk toward the exit. She had to pass by the podium to get to the hallway. As she walked, the musicians stopped what they were doing. Thomas stood up and stepped out from behind the cello section. He didn't say anything. He just nodded at her as she passed, a look of deep respect on his face. Others did the same. They stopped talking, they stopped packing, and they watched her go. It was like they were saying goodbye to a celebrity, but it felt more personal than that. Ilora kept her eyes focused on the hallway ahead, but she could feel their gazes. It made her feel tall. It made her feel like she belonged. As she reached the side of the podium, Kessler stepped down. He stood in her path, blocking her way for a second. Ilora stopped. She looked up at him. He was much taller than her, and for a moment, the old fear tried to creep back in. She clutched the strap of her bag tighter. Kessler looked down at her. He saw the young girl, the borrowed suit, the tired eyes. He didn't see a rival anymore. He saw a teacher. "You play," Kessler said softly, choosing his words carefully, "like you have nothing left to lose. It is dangerous, but it is beautiful." Ilora blinked, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "Thank you, maestro," she whispered. She didn't know what else to say. "Do not lose that," he said. He stepped aside, clearing the way for her. "We will see you tomorrow, Miss Ilora." He used her first name. He never used first names. Ilora gave him a small, shy smile. "Yes, maestro." She walked past him and through the open door into the carpeted hallway. The air out here was cooler. She walked a few steps away from the rehearsal hall door and leaned back against the wall. She let out a long breath that she felt like she had been holding for hours. Inside the room, she could hear the musicians talking and laughing. She could hear the sound of instruments being packed into cases. It was a happy sound. Kessler was in there too. She could hear his low voice talking to Thomas. He wasn't shouting. Ilora looked down at her hands. They were the same hands she had always had. They were tired, and her fingers ached a little bit, but as she stood there in the quiet hallway, she felt different. She didn't feel like the scared girl in the borrowed suit anymore. She felt like a musician. She felt like she had a voice. And she knew, deep down, that tomorrow, when she played for her mother, and for the orchestra, it would be even better. She wasn't just playing notes anymore. She was playing life itself.